The wind in the Wind River foothills did not whisper, it howled. It screamed down the jagged ridges and howled through the pine groves like a thing alive. It twisted snow into wild, stinging spirals, erasing the line between earth and sky, leaving only a churning wall of white and cold. It was the kind of storm that made grown men pray and horses tremble. William Wilthorne hunched against the gale atop his Appaloosa mare, his oilskin coat snapping behind him like a banner. Snow coated the brim of his Stetson and rimmed his dark beard with ice. 36 years of frontier living had hardened him like the rocky land he called home. But the cold still cut deep. His sage-to-reap, his ranch, Silver Creek, lay another 2 hours down the ravine, but the storm had turned the trail into a death trap. He would have taken shelter sooner if not for the sound. At first, he'd thought it was the wind playing tricks on his mind, a high-pitched, keening cry, barely audible beneath the roar of the storm. But when he stopped to listen again, srut, heart thudding, he heard it thin, desperate, unmistakably human. A child, crying. Will reined in his horse and dismounted, booted feet crunching in snow already knee-deep. He scanned the swirling white and followed the sound downhill, his senses alert. No one lived this far out, especially not in winter, but the wail grew clearer with every step, then doubled. 2 voices, 2 infants. What in God's name? Then he saw a broken wagon, half buried in a snowdrift beneath the overhang of a rocky slope. One wheel was splintered, the shaft snapped clean through. It looked like it had tumbled off the pass above. Nearby, a figure slumped against a fallen pine, motionless beneath a shredded blanket. He rushed forward. It was a woman, as Funashiratorn, barely more than a girl. Her skin was deathly pale, lips blue, and her dress was soaked through with snow and blood. In her arms, swaddled in the last dry corner of her coat, were 2 crying newborns, red-faced, tiny, and gasping against the cold. She clutched them to her chest with the last vestiges of strength, her arms stiff with determination even in unconsciousness. Will dropped to his knees in the snow. Mabas from Zomonema. He called, touching her shoulder. Can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, not all the way, just enough for him to see their color startling blue, like the frozen heart of the Wind River. Her cracked lips moved. And help, my babies. That was all. Her head lolled sideways. The twins wailed louder. Will acted without hesitation. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the babies first, then carefully lifted the woman into his arms. She was frighteningly light, and the cold had nearly stolen her breath. The twins' boys were alive but barely. He carried all 3 to his horse, secured the coat to protect the children from the wind, then mounted up with her in front of him. The journey back to Silver Creek Ranch would take longer in the storm, but they had no other choice. As the Appaloosa picked its careful way through snow and ice, Will held the woman close, her head against his shoulder, her breath shallow but steady. The babies whimpered against his chest, each sound tugging at an old scar in his soul. It had been 6 years since he'd held a newborn, 6 years since Sarah. His chest tightened, but he forced the memory down. This wasn't the time. There would be time for ghosts later if they survived. He tightened his grip on the reins and on the unconscious woman in his arms. I've got you, he muttered into the wind. All of you. Just hold on. The lights of Silver Creek Ranch barely pierced the blizzard as he approached. The main house loomed large and dark, snow piled high against its timber walls. He rode straight to the barn, flung the doors open, and led the horse inside. The warmth of the animals and the faint scent of hay hit him like a wall. He dismounted, kicked the door shut, and laid the woman gently on a pile of dry straw. Then he turned to the babies. They were cold, red-faced, and squalling good signs. He reminded himself. Crying meant lungs. Crying meant life. He stripped off his gloves, checked their fingers and toes. No frostbite, by some miracle. Then he turned to her. She was still bleeding less now, but dangerously pale. He didn't know much about birthing or postpartum care, but he knew she needed warmth and fluid fast. He didn't waste time with questions. Within minutes, he had a fire blazing in the hearth of the ranch house, clean blankets warming near the stone, and hot water simmering in the kettle. He brought them inside, first the babies, then her, and laid them by the fire. She hadn't stirred since the wagon, and her breathing was shallow. He cleaned the infants gently, wrapped them in soft cotton and wool, and placed them in the crook of the large chair near the fire. One yawned, the other blinked at him, eyes barely open. He'd known Sarah's son only hours before the storm had taken him. But this fragile miracle, it stirred something in him he'd long buried beneath layers of snow and silence. Next, he focused on the woman. Her skin had warmed slightly, but her pulse was still weak. He lifted her gently, stripped off the wet layers, and dressed her in one of Sarah's old flannel nightgowns. It had sat in a drawer untouched for 6 years. He hadn't had the heart to throw it away. He fed her sips of warm broth and water, rubbing her arms and legs to coax back circulation. He worked through the night, never leaving her side for long. And slowly, hour by hour, color returned to her cheeks. At dawn, as pale light crept through frost-laced windows, she stirred. Her lips moved again. "Tutunadi, to the boys." Will leaned in. "They're safe. Warm and fed, sure as sure now morn. You are too." She blinked up at him, confusion clouding her features. "Where?" "My name is Will Thorne," he said quietly. "You're at Silver Creek Ranch. You were near dead when I found you." She tried to sit up, winced, and lay back down. Her voice was a whisper. "Clara Evans, how are you?" I didn't know where else to go." "You don't need to explain," Will said, already placing another pillow beneath her back. "You can rest now." But her eyes, though heavy, still held that ember of mother's panic. "If, the twins?" Will turned, nodded toward the fireplace. "Still sleeping. Both of them. Tough little fellas." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, vanishing into her tangled hair. Thank God. She looked so young, Will thought. No older than 20, and yet she had braved death, childbirth, and a blizzard with nothing but instinct and grit. "Do you have family?" he asked. She shook her head. "No one left. My husband, he died last fall. His family turned me out. Said the children weren't his. Said I was a liar." Her voice broke. Will's jaw tightened. He'd known men like that, petty, powerful cowards who thought cruelty was justice. He'd sent some of them to prison in his days as a Union scout. Others, to the graven. "One Kenisharin one was. You won't be turned out again," he said firmly. Clara looked up at him, brows furrowed. Why did you help us?" Will looked away. "I once failed to save someone," he said. "Someone I loved. I swore I wouldn't let it happen again." He expected her to ask questions. Instead, she simply nodded, then closed her eyes and slipped into sleep. He sat there, beside the fire, for a long time watching the snow drift past the window, listening to the faint, even breaths of the woman and her children. For the first time in years, the silence of the ranch wasn't hollow. It was full, yet full of new life, full of second chances. Will leaned back in the chair and watched the flames. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this family be torn apart. Not by storms, not by men, not by the past, not again. She was left wounded with her twin newborns until a Comanche warrior called her his own. Amarnowan, in one word count. Sipfihern. The wind bit at Will's face as he urged his horse through the heavy curtain of snow. Behind him, Clara lay draped over the horse's back, arms still curled protectively around the two tiny bundles, swaddled in his fur-lined coat. Her breaths were shallow, each one a fragile puff of warmth against the bitter cold. The children stirred now and again, the faintest cries rising above the storm. Will kept glancing over his shoulder, as if the very memory of the past might come galloping through the snow to claim them. He'd seen this before. Too many years ago, he had ridden in a similar storm too late. Sarah had gone into labor early. Will had been in town, just a few hours away, gathering medicine and supplies, not expecting the birth for another month. When the storm broke across the plains like the crack of a whip, he tried to ride back, but the snow swallowed the road, blinded the horse, buried every tree and post in endless white. By the time he'd made it home, Sarah was gone. So was the child they'd never even named. That had been the end of something in him. He hadn't wept. He hadn't screamed. He'd simply buried them on the northern ridge under a pine tree, covered the grave with river stones, and stopped speaking for almost a year. People in town said Will Thorne became ice that winter. And now, a warned for anyone. Here he was again racing death, but this time, death was not going to win. The Silver Creek Ranch stood like a lone bastion against the wilderness. The house was large, built of rough-hewn logs and Wyoming stone, with thick windows and heavy shutters. Smoke billowed from the chimney, curling upward into the gray sky. Will kicked the door open with his boot. snow tumbling in with him. The hearth fire he'd lit that morning still burned low in the hearth, casting the room in an amber glow. He didn't stop to warm his hands. He moved quickly first, laying the babies in a lined crate near the fire, one that had once been used to carry feed. Then, with a gentleness few would have imagined possible in a man like him, he laid Clara on the old sofa near the hearth. Her skin was cold, her lips tinged blue. He brought warm water, stripped off the frozen remnants of her coat and blanket, wrapped her in wool throws. He sat on a stool by the fire and held her hand between his palms. She stirred, eyelids fluttering. "You're safe." Done. He muttered, almost to himself. Her lips parted. "The babies. Hanarni. They're fine," he said. "Alive. Warm." He looked toward the crate. One of the infants was twitching his fingers. The other let out a low, hiccuping cry. "I think the boy's hungry." She blinked slowly. Her throat worked. Dry as cotton. "Boy and girl." Will nodded. I'll see to it." He stepped into the kitchen, poured milk from a tin jug, and warmed it gently over the stove. He hadn't fed a baby in 15 years, not since his sister visited with her twins from Texas. But his hands were steady, and within minutes, the two children were each wrapped in flannel and sucking down milk like survivors. He watched them with wonder and a pain he couldn't name. Behind him, Clara whispered, Who are you?" He turned. "Sir William Thorne. Call me Will. This is my place." "Why?" she began, then winced as pain lanced her lower body. He approached and knelt beside the sofa. "Because I've been here before, and I didn't get there in time last time. I won't let it happen again." Clara stared at him for a long moment. "You lost someone." "My wife. My son. Storm like this. Too late." Her face softened, her hand reaching for the blanket as if to pull it closer to her heart. "I'm sorry." Will stood. "Don't be. Just rest." For 3 days, the storm kept the world locked outside. Snow draped the fence posts like bleached linen. The barn disappeared behind a white curtain. Coyotes howled at night, their voices distant and mournful. Inside, the house came alive. Clara's fever passed by the second night. Her strength returned slowly. Will tended to the babies, rocking them when Clara was too weak, boiling cloth diapers, cleaning up spit and mewling cries at all hours. He built up the fire every hour to keep the rooms warm, cooked simple stews from dried meat and carrots, and gave Clara the strong broth from the top of the pot. "You don't talk much," she said one night as he sat near the window, sharpening a knife. "No, but you listen." He nodded. She watched him a long time before adding softly, "My husband didn't listen." Will looked up. "What happened to him?" "Pneumonia." Verticidi. 5 months ago, we buried him at the foot of a pine near the Laramie Trail. His family, they blamed me. He raised an eyebrow. He was their golden son. Elias Shurshamarikan, his brother, Ersikanwar was Grishchurn, called me a curse, said the babies were bastards, accused me of seducing him for land and inheritance. Will didn't respond, just kept sharpening. Clara's voice dropped. "They threw me out of the house 2 weeks before I gave birth. I tried to make it back east. Thought maybe my cousin in Ohio might take me in. But the wagon gave out. The horse bolted. I was too far gone." "You made it farther than most," he said, pausing to inspect the blade's edge. She turned her gaze toward the fire. "I thought I was going to die. I'd made peace with it, but I couldn't bear the thought of them dying with me." Will stood and laid the knife aside. He crossed the room and looked down at the babies, sleeping now in the crate lined with soft wool. "They won't die," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." Clara blinked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Why do you care?" He answered her honestly. "I don't know. Maybe because it should have been me back then. Maybe because you remind me what a mother looks like when she fights for her babies." She looked away, blinking hard. A week passed. The trail was still impassable, but Will's supply lines would hold. He had meat. In front of meat, flour, candles, firewood. He could live out the winter. And now, he would do it with 3 more mouths in the house. He didn't mind. Clara walked now, slowly but surely, around the hearth. Kisser wenan baninont. The babies nursed well. She sewed little socks from old flannel shirts. She swept. She hummed. Ram. One morning, Will brought in 2 rabbits and laid them on the table. Clara took a knife and began dressing them without hesitation. "You know your way around game." he remarked. She shrugged. Grew up in Pennsylvania Hill Country. My pa taught me a few things before he passed. Ma died of cholera. I was 12. Silence lingered a moment. Will cleared his throat. The girl, what's her name? Clara smiled softly. Beth, what's her name? Assured done. The boy's Henry. He nodded. Strong names. We did, Kane. She looked at him then, eyes deep and searching. Will, what happens now? He paused, as if the question hadn't occurred to him. You've saved us, brought us back from death. But spring's still months away. And Elias, he'll be looking for me. For them, Swan my son. Will stepped closer, wiping his hands on a rag. I've got 50 square miles of property. No one gets on it without me knowing. No judge, Cheworm. No banker, where's done. No fancy Eastern lawyer. This is my land, she swallowed. But I can't stay forever. You didn't ask for this. No, I didn't, he said slowly. But maybe that's the point. I didn't ask for this. And yet here you are. Their eyes locked. Something deep passed between them, not romance. Not yet, but the beginning of trust, of mutual respect, of survival forged together. Will said, you and the babies have a place here. For as long as you want it. Clara's voice cracked. Thank you. He nodded. There's just one thing. She tensed. He gestured to the cradle. You're going to need a bigger crib. That night, Will sat on the porch alone, a flask of whiskey at his side. The stars were brilliant against the cold black sky. Somewhere inside, Clara was singing a lullaby, soft. Warren, say, sweet, awesome. He listened. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, there was peace, harmony, and that, he knew, was worth holding on to. She was left wounded with her twin newborns until a Comanche warrior called her his own. The snow began to soften in the days after the storm. Icicles hung like silver daggers from the eaves of the Silver Creek Ranch, glinting in the pale winter sun. The sky lightened from pewter gray to a frosted blue. And the wind that once screamed through the pines now whispered gently, as if exhausted from its fury. Lev factu, slow and hesitant, returned to the high plains. Inside the big log house, it was the children who first filled the silence. Their cries echoed through the wooden halls, sharp and immediate first with hunger, then with discomfort, then simply to remind the world they were still alive. Willie Resicadum, who had lived in that house for years with only the ticking of a grandfather clock and the creaking of old floorboards for company, found himself startled by the noise, but oddly comforted. Every cry was a promise of life, of resilience. Clara was healing, though slowly. Her body bore the weight of childbirth and exposure, and the pain still lingered in her hips and lower back. But her strength returned in small ways each day. She could sit upright by the fire now, and she insisted on feeding both babies herself. She'd sing to them in a voice that was soft and worn, like a well-loved quilt. Will never asked about the song's origin, but he always paused in his work when he heard it. The first morning she was strong enough to stand unaided. Clara limped to the hearth and knelt beside it, arranging logs with a practiced hand. Will looked up from the ledger book he'd been filling out at the dining table. You don't need to do that, he said. I want to, she replied simply. He let her. There was a quiet pride in the way she held herself. Even now, in worn clothes borrowed from an old chest upstairs, the fire crackled to life, and light danced over her face. That afternoon, Will offered her a proper room upstairs. I sleep fine by the fire. Clara said, you shouldn't be on that sofa with the babies. He said, the upstairs room's warmer than you'd think. Faces the morning sun. I can bring the crib up. Clara hesitated. You've already given us more than I have any right to expect. Will looked at her a long moment. You're not a charity case. Clara, you're a guest. That word guest sat oddly on her tongue. It had been so long since she'd been welcomed anywhere. The next day settled into something like a rhythm. Will would rise before dawn, tend to the animals, and shovel snow from the paths between the house and the barn. Clara, Mom, with help from the housekeeper's journal she found in the pantry, started baking small loaves of bread and drying meats for jerky. She found comfort in work. Beth and Henry, though only weeks old, began to show the first signs of distinction. Beth was quieter, observant, always staring at Clara with solemn brown eyes. Henry was fussier, greedy for warmth and motion, arms flailing whenever he was hungry. One night, after putting the babies to sleep, Clara found herself sitting on the front porch. She'd wrapped herself in a shawl and clutched a steaming cup of tea, her breath curling in the cold air. Will joined her without a word, holding a tin of tobacco. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Clara spoke. "You live like a man with ghosts." Will didn't look at her. "I suppose I do. Is that why you stay so far from the house during the day?" He took a slow breath. "After Sarah died, this place was more tomb than home. I shut doors. Let dust gather. Stopped setting the table for two. It became easier not to hear the echoes." She looked at him then. Really looked. His beard was thicker now, hair wine-tossed, hands rough and nicked from rope and weather. But his eyes, blue and sharp, carried more grief than age. "Sarah," he titibirmum, Clara said gently. "She's the one you told me about." He nodded. "She would have loved this porch. Would have sat right where you are now, swaddling our baby and telling me to stop fidgeting." Clara smiled faintly. "I can see that. Never met a woman more stubborn." "Oh, I don't know," she said, sipping her tea. That earned a chuckle. The first she'd heard from him. "I keep thinking about that night," she said after a pause. "You didn't even hesitate. You just lifted us up like we mattered, like we weren't already lost." He turned toward her. "You weren't lost, just waiting to be found." One morning, a week later, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen when she stumbled upon a locked drawer in the corner armoire. Not prying, just cleaning. She opened the other drawers, dusty linens, old silverware, dried herbs, then tried the locked one and paused. When Will returned, she asked about it. "Old papers," he said. "Letters, Sarah's drawings." Clara didn't press further. She understood. Grief stored itself in strange places. Instead, she focused on what she could control, bringing warmth back into the house. She unpacked the remaining boxes in the attic, finding curtains that had never been hung and baby clothes Sarah must have sewn once. Long ago, she dusted the parlor and uncovered a rocking chair. She filled the house with scents again: gingerbread, roasted potatoes, lavender soap, and Will noticed. He didn't say anything, but she saw it in the way he lingered inside longer. In the second cup of coffee he poured for himself after chores. In the way he touched the crib once before going to bed. One night, he asked, "How did you come by the names Beth and Henry?" "My mother's favorite story was about a girl named Beth who died young, but left behind the purest heart. And Henry, that was my father's name, strong and kind. I wanted something of them to live on. They'll be proud," Will said quietly. She turned toward him. "And your son, what would you have named him?" He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, "Isaac." Clara smiled. "Then maybe someday we'll plant a tree for Isaac." "For all of them." Will looked at her, really looked, and then, with a voice as soft as falling snow, he said, "Maybe we will one. That week, Clara ventured into town for the first time, wrapped in Will's old riding coat, her hair tucked beneath a bonnet. Will rode beside her silently, but people noticed. They always noticed her. At the general store, whispers followed them down the aisles. Not cruel, but curious. "Is that Will Thorne?" "Dunray," someone muttered. "And a woman with a babe. 2 babes. That can't be his." But Clara held her head high, ignored the murmurs, and bought what she needed. Flour, a cloth, new thread. At the counter, Will placed his hand over hers and paid. They rode home in silence, the wind tugging at their sleeves. "That was kind of you," she said quietly. "But you don't have to do that. Let people talk. Let them wonder." "Good first, I don't mind the talk," he said. "Let them say what they want. I know what's true." Clara glanced at him sideways. "And what is true? Will." He didn't answer immediately. But when he did, it was soft. "That you and those babies, you belong here. And no one's taking you away." Her breath caught. "You really believe that?" He looked straight ahead. "I don't just believe it. I'll fight for it." And Clara, in that moment, knew one thing more than any other. She was no longer a woman surviving out of necessity. She was beginning to hope. The quiet peace that had begun to settle over Silver Creek was shattered the day the letter arrived. It came on the back of a tired chestnut mare, delivered by a ranch hand returning from town. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, bearing the elegant, embossed seal of a Chicago law firm. Will didn't open it right away. He stood on the porch for a long while, fingers running over the heavy paper, sensing the poison inside before even reading a word. Clara was inside, humming softly as she rocked one of the twins, while the other lay sleeping in a sun-warm basket near the hearth. The scent of fresh cornbread drifted from the kitchen. It was a moment carved from the kind of life Will had long believed lost to him, simple, steady, tender. He tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his coat, determined not to let it touch that moment. Not yet. But later, gee, after dinner and after Clara had retired with the children, he sat alone at his desk, lit only by the oil lamp's steady flame. He slit the envelope open with the edge of his hunting knife and unfolded the letter. Elias Vance had found her. The words were polite on the surface, laced with legal terms and manufactured concern, but Will could feel the venom behind every sentence. The letter claimed that Mr. Vance, in his position as executor of his deceased brother's estate, had become gravely concerned for the well-being of the late Jonathan Evans's widow and the twin children presumed to be his heirs. He requested, in the spirit of familial duty, that Clara and the children return to Chicago so that custody and inheritance matters could be sorted in a formal and lawful fashion. Will crushed the letter in his hand. He had read men like Elias before, men who spoke in silk but moved like vipers. Elias hadn't come to reclaim a family, he'd come to erase one. If the children remained alive and legally connected to the Evans name, his access to the inheritance and control over the Chicago estate would be threatened. He would stop at nothing to sever that threat. The next morning, Will didn't tell Clara about the letter. Not yet. Instead, he saddled his horse and rode into the hills, needing the wind and solitude to burn off the fury churning inside him. Up among the pines, where the air smelled of sap and snowmelt, he let out a long breath and began to plan. 3 days later, Elias Vance arrived in person. He came in a black coach with polished wheels, pulled by 2 sleek, coal-dark horses, flanked by hired guns dressed like gentlemen, but with the eyes of jackals. He stepped down with the same cold confidence of a banker surveying a vault. Tall, sharply dressed in a city-cut charcoal suit, his face was clean-shaven, and his blonde hair was neatly parted. He didn't look like he belonged in Wyoming. And he didn't try to, what current, or tin, William Thorne. Elias said, offering a gloved hand that Will ignored. I appreciate your hospitality, though I must admit, it's a shame we meet under such unfortunate misunderstandings. You're not welcome here, Will said simply, his body square in the doorway of his ranch house. Elias's eyes flicked over Will's shoulder, noting the movement inside, probably Clara holding one of the twins. I come only with concern for my late brother's wife and children. A woman of her standing should not be buried in the wild. My family has resources, a home. Will stepped forward, closing the space between them. She has a home, he said evenly, and a family. She doesn't need a snake from the east slithering in and pretending it's about love. Elias's smile tightened. That woman is living off a lie. She seduced my brother, probably for his money, and now she's hiding with his supposed children under the protection of a lonely, grieving cowboy who doesn't know any better. I could make this very public. Mr. Thorne, you make one move against her, Will said, voice low, and it won't be public. It'll be 6 feet underground, private, and permanent. The guns at Elias's side shifted, hands resting near polished revolvers. But Elias, to his credit or perhaps foolishness, didn't draw. He held Will's eyes for a long moment, then turned, brushing imaginary dust from his coat sleeve. Very well, he said smoothly. I see how things stand, but I assure you, this will not end here. The law has a long reach, Mr. Subby Thorne, and I have more than enough money to help it stretch. He climbed back into his coach, and the party turned down the road, leaving a trail of dust behind them. Will didn't speak of the visit to Clara that night. He needed time to make his next move, time to be certain of what he already knew in his gut. This wasn't just a threat. It was the beginning of a siege. 2 days later, the town sheriff arrived at the ranch with a letter in hand. Clara read it on the porch, trembling as her eyes scanned the legal document. Elias had filed for full guardianship of the children, claiming Clara unfit due to mental instability, illness, and moral corruption. He had paid witnesses in Chicago to testify that Clara had lied about her marriage, that she had threatened her husband, that she had no family to speak for her. The hearing was set to take place in Redemption within a week. Will sat beside her as the color drained from her face. He wants to take them, she whispered, her hands tightening on the page. He'll see him. He'll win. Won't he? Not if I have anything to say about it. Will said, but what can we do? Her voice broke. He's got money, lawyers, friends in the courts. So we want to furious to want to mean on no one. He'll say I'm mad, that I'm not their real mother. He'll twist everything. I don't even have the marriage certificate anymore. He could take them from me. Will leaned forward, looking at her in a way that was not just protective, but fierce. Do one. Clary, want to marno. He said softly but firmly. Listen to me. There's one thing we can do. One thing he can't fight with all the money in the world. She looked at him with desperate, wet eyes. What did Ramatun? Will's jaw clenched, then loosened as he made the choice. We make it so those boys are mine. Officially, on paper, Aching. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean we sign the birth records. I claim them. As father, we make it legal in public. If I'm their father, no court in Wyoming will rule against me. Elias won't be able to touch them. Clara hesitated. But they aren't your children. They are now Suriname ones, Will said simply. They were the minute I found them in your arms beneath that snow-covered tree. And you? He paused, voice low. You're not just someone I rescued. You're someone I choose. A long silence passed between them. Then Clara nodded, eyes fierce and clear. We'll do it, she said. We fight. And so they did. The next morning, Will rode with Clara and the twins to Redemption. They walked into the town hall hand in hand. When the clerk looked up from his dusty desk, Will placed the filled-out forms down with calm finality. William Thorne father, Clara Evans mother, Samuel and Jonah Thorne sons. The ink was still wet when they stepped outside, but already the tide had begun to turn. That night, as Clara tucked the boys into bed, Will stood in the doorway. The children cooed and wriggled, utterly unaware that their futures had just been rewritten. Thank you, Clara whispered to him. Will shook his head. You don't need to thank me. She walked to him, placed a hand gently on his chest. Then let me promise you something instead. She said, no matter what happens next, I will never run again. He nodded, his hand brushing hers. And I will never let anyone take this from you. Not now. Not ever. One and they born. Out in the distance, thunder grumbled behind the mountains. A storm was gathering, but this time, Will and Clara would face it not as strangers, but as a family. The frost had not yet lifted from the morning grass when Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, arms wrapped around herself, watching the twin boys sleep peacefully in the woven cradle nestled on the porch. The sun crept up slowly over the ridge, casting long golden rays across the Silver Creek Ranch. But peace had not found her heart, not since the letter. Will Thorne leaned against one of the porch beams, his Stetson pulled low, arms crossed as he watched her. The courthouse notice lay folded neatly in the pocket of his coat, a thin but dangerous piece of paper with the seal of the territory and the venom of a snake. It summoned Clara to a custody hearing initiated by Elias Vance. He had accused her of being an unfit mother, of endangering the boys, of having no legitimate claim to raise them. Clara turned toward Will slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those fierce, ocean blue eyes, were steady. Ah, he's going to take them, she said. He'll use his money, his name. He'll say anything. Will's jaw tightened. Then we'll give him something he can't tear apart. Clara blinked. What do you mean? Will straightened from the post. I've already spoken to my lawyer. There's a way to protect the boys, make them legally mine. Her breath caught. Legally yours. In this territory, he continued, a man can acknowledge children born outside of marriage, as long as the mother consents. No one can contest it unless the biological father steps forward. Her heart thudded. But what about you? His eyes didn't waver. I meant what I said when I carried you out of that storm. You're not alone, and they're not alone either. Let me do this for them. For you. Clara stepped back, her mind racing. You don't owe us this. Well, you've already done more than I don't do things out of guilt, he said gently. Not anymore. She stared at him for a long moment. And if I say yes, then we go to town tomorrow. And I write my name on something that matters. The next morning, the three of them bundled into the wagon Clara, holding both boys close to her chest, and Will at the reins. The trail into redemption was quiet under a soft layer of snow. There was no sun, only the gray promise of a winter to come inside the county clerk's office. The fire crackled low in the corner stove. The clerk, a balding man with thick spectacles, raised his brow when Will explained what he needed. Declaration of paternity for both children. Will said plainly, "Twins?" the clerk asked, adjusting his glasses. Will nodded. "Daniel and Micah. They'll be known as Thorn. Edebroni Reina Weiner." Going forward, Clara signed first, her hand trembling only slightly. Then Will waited to one us, Ben. It was done in less than 10 minutes. The names etched in ink, preserved in the county record for all time as they stepped out into the street, snowflakes beginning to fall again. Clara looked over at Will. "You just made them your sons." He met her gaze. They already were. Word spread fast in redemption. By sundown, whispers of the event had made their rounds in the saloons, the blacksmith shop, and the church vestibule. Most folks were too polite to comment openly, but Clara felt the weight of curious glances at the general store and knew what they were thinking. Some praised Will's decency, others muttered about impropriety, about a widowed woman living under a rancher's roof with no marriage certificate. But Clara didn't care. The boys were safe. Will had seen to that. Elias Vance, however, did care. The letter from his lawyer arrived 2 days later, full of accusations. Falsehood, fraud, we never need more of one. He claimed Will's declaration was illegitimate, an attempt to steal the Vance family line. Enclosed was a fresh subpoena, demanding a court hearing to determine the true parentage and rightful custody of the children. Will read it, folded it, and placed it in the fire. But Clara knew Elias wouldn't give up. He couldn't. To him, the children weren't human beings. They were pieces of a financial puzzle obstacles to his inheritance. "What will we do now?" she asked, standing by the firelight. Will's expression darkened. "Prepare a brillianturi serious than The Silver Creek Ranch transformed in the days that followed. Will hired extra hands, including 2 ex-cavalrymen who now patrolled the fence lines. He trained Clara how to fire a rifle and had her practice in the woodshed every evening. The twins, unaware of the growing tension, continued to smile and gurgle and reach for their mother's hands. On the outside, Will remained calm. But inside, he was simmering. Elias had humiliated him once years ago in Chicago, when Will had been a young man trying to invest in land before the war. Elias, already a banker then, had laughed at his proposals and called his dreams cowboy fantasies. Now the tables had turned. Will had built Silver Creek with his bare hands. It was more than land, it was redemption. And now Elias wanted to tear it all down again. The morning of the hearing arrived with a bitter wind and a gray sky. Redemption's courthouse stood like a lone stone in the center of town, its bell tower silent. Will wore his best coat and a black vest. Clara wore a pale blue shawl over her dress. The twins bundled close to her chest. They entered the courtroom together, a picture of quiet strength. Elias Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, smug in a dark 3-piece suit. His lawyer, a slick man from Chicago, carried a briefcase full of affidavits and threats. But when Will stood to testify, his voice was clear. "I signed those documents because those boys are mine in every way that counts. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does, and I will fight to protect what's mine." Clara took the stand next. Her voice didn't tremble once. "Will Thorne saved our lives. And more than that, he gave my children a name, a future. He is more of a father to them than anyone in Elias Vance's family ever tried to be." When the judge adjourned, no decision was made on the spot. It would take weeks, but the shift in the room was clear. Elias had not expected resolve. He had not expected love. And he wasn't done. That night, the skies cracked with thunder, and snow began to fall harder than it had in weeks. Will sat cleaning his rifle by lamplight, while Clara rocked the boys to sleep. A knock came at the door. It was one of the ranch hands, soaked through. "Riders?" he said, coming fast, armed. Will didn't ask who. He already knew. "Surkindiponawan." He stood, chambered round, and looked at Clara. "Take the boys. Go to the root cellar. Stay low. What about you? I'll hold them off. But you're one man." He kissed her forehead. "I'm enough." She looked at him, tears in her eyes, but there was no time. The storm outside was no longer just weather. It was war. The morning was heavy with snow-laden clouds. A strange hush hung over Silver Creek Ranch. Not the usual quiet of winter, but something more pressing, like the land itself was holding its breath. Will Thorne stood on the porch, Wana reminded him, oiling his rifle with methodical precision. Every click and scrape was a reminder that peace didn't last long in the Wyoming wilderness, especially not when men like Elias Vance wanted something that wasn't theirs. The custody hearing was over, but Clara hadn't slept since the verdict had been delayed. She knew Elias. He wouldn't accept defeat, and that made him dangerous. "Any riders spotted this morning?" Clara asked quietly, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders as she joined Will outside. Will gave a small nod. Tom saw movement near the south ridge. "Could be nothing. Could be scouts?" Clara glanced toward the hills. "You think he'll come himself? He's the kind that likes to watch things burn." Will's jaw tightened. "I think he'll want to see this one up close." Inside the house, the twins cooed softly in their cradle. The air was heavy with tension, but their little voices brought a kind of clarity to Clara. This wasn't just about legal papers or property disputes anymore. This was about survival, and she would not let anyone take her children again. That night, snow began to fall, light at first, then faster, thicker, swirling like powdered ghosts across the open field. Will had posted 2 men at the far edge of the property, both armed and wary. The lanterns inside the ranch house glowed against the windows, casting long shadows across the snow. Clara tucked the twins into their cradle and kissed each of their foreheads. Then she walked to the cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the Colt revolver Will had insisted she learn to use. Her hands were steady now. She turned to Will. "Do you think he'll wait till dawn?" Will shook his head. A man like Elias uses darkness to his advantage. As if summoned by the words, a shot rang out in the distance. Then another. "Wanahananastan to me." Then came the sound of hooves rushing, pounding, closer than they should have been. Will yanked his rifle from the wall and moved to the window. "Enim. They're here." Chaos exploded. Gunshots cracked through the night as riders burst through the front gates. They wore scarves around their faces and carried torches and pistols. Fire flared at the edges of the barn, where someone had already set a blaze. The wind fed the flames greedily. Will fired the first shot, dropping a rider mid-charge. One of the ranch hands took down another near the chicken coop. But they kept coming 5, 6, or Warren, maybe more. Were worse. Clara grabbed the twins and ran to the trap door beneath the pantry, the root cellar Will had reinforced just days earlier. She laid the boys inside, wrapped them in quilts, and kissed them with a whispered promise. "I'll come back. I swear it." She closed the trap door and turned toward the sound of breaking glass. Outside, Will was fighting like a man possessed. He moved through the snow and smoke, rifle blazing, cutting down threats one after the other. He took cover behind the trough when a bullet struck the railing near his head. Clara burst through the door, firing her revolver at a shadowy figure climbing the porch. The shot missed, but it startled him long enough for Will to finish the job. "What are you doing out here?" He growled. "I'm not hiding while you fight for my children," she shouted back. They stood together as 2 more riders approached, both armed. Will aimed for the first. Clara took a deep breath and shot the second man in the leg. He screamed and fell backward, disappearing into the snow. The flames now engulfed the barn fully, casting eerie orange light over the ranch yard. Sparks leapt into the night sky like fireflies fleeing a war zone. For a moment, the gunfire stopped. Then a voice echoed across the field. "Will Thorne, you can come out and die like a man, or watch your ranch burn to the ground." It was Elias. Will stepped forward, rifle ready, snow clinging to his coat. "You never could win straight, Vance, and you never could see when to quit," Elias called back, emerging from behind a cluster of trees with 2 armed men beside him. "You think those kids make you a father? You think that woman makes you whole? They make me human," Will said, "which is more than I can say for you." Elias raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a distant crack rang out. One of the hired guns beside Elias dropped, clutching his shoulder. Tom, the ranch hand stationed on the ridge, had taken the shot. Elias turned in panic. Seizing the moment, ran toward the well where Will kept 2 barrels of kerosene for emergencies. She picked up a lantern, lit it, and tossed it toward the oil-soaked ground where one of the torches had fallen earlier. The explosion was not massive, but it was enough. Fire surged across the earth in a flash, cutting Elias off from his men and blinding his horse. He screamed, disoriented, and fled into the trees. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader vanish and their advantage gone, began to retreat. One by one, the ranch hands emerged from the shadows, chasing them off the property. Silence returned slowly. Smoke drifted across the field. The barn smoldered in ruin. Clara ran to the root cellar and opened it. Heart pounding, the twins were there. Safe. For me or waters, safe. Asleep. Mercer Somemorn. She sank to her knees and wept not from fear, but from something far deeper, from knowing they had survived, from knowing they had defended their family together. Ledermurnermun and Masurum. Inside the house, Will sat by the hearth, his coat bloodied and his leg wrapped tight. Clara sat beside him with the boys in her lap. We could have died tonight, she said softly. Will reached over, brushing a soot-streaked curl from her cheek. But we didn't. I was scared. I was too. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You saved us. He looked at her, his expression gentler than she'd ever seen. You saved me back. And in the firelight, beneath the scent of ash and pine, something shifted between them, quiet, powerful, undeniable. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family. The sky over Silver Creek had cleared by morning. The snowfall light now, almost delicate like the storm had washed the land clean, but left its bruises behind. Smoke still curled from the charred remains of the barn, and blood stained the snow in front of the porch. The scent of gunpowder clung to the wind, and the silence that followed the battle was too still to be comforting. Clara moved about the house quietly, checking the twins every few minutes, as though some piece of her couldn't accept that they had made it through the night unharmed. She couldn't shake the image of Will, bleeding and unbending in the yard, protecting them with nothing but grit and fire. He was inside now, resting on the settee, one leg propped up and bandaged from hip to knee. The cut had gone deep, but it wasn't fatal. Clara had cleaned and stitched it herself, hands steady even as her heart trembled. She carried a cup of tea into the parlor and set it down next to him. You saved this place, she whispered. Will opened his eyes and studied her face for a long moment. You lit the fuse. Presto renoi e forsan. They shared a quiet look that spoke of more than just survival. Something had shifted between them since the fire. No longer just reluctant allies or a man and a woman sharing a roof out of necessity, they had become something deeper, forged in heat and danger. Then came a knock at the door. Not the violent pounding of hired guns, but a steady, official rap. Clara froze. Will sat up with a groan and gestured toward the shotgun leaning by the wall. But it wasn't another enemy. It was Marshal Boone, the federal marshal from Laramie, his broad shoulders framed in the doorway, snow caught in his mustache. You, Thorne? He asked, stepping inside with the air of someone who already knew the answer. Will nodded slowly. That's right. Boone shut the door behind him and glanced around the house. He noted the boarded-up windows, the scorched coat rack, and the rifle marks on the floor with an experienced eye. I hear you had a little trouble last night. Will's mouth tightened. You could say that. Clara entered the room, baby Elijah in her arms. The marshal tipped his hat slightly at her. Boone wasted no time. I'm here because a telegram reached Laramie yesterday morning. An anonymous tip said a man named Elias Vance had crossed into Wyoming with hired guns, intent on reclaiming a pair of children and disposing of witnesses. The message gave this address. Clara's heart raced. Was it you who sent it? The marshal asked. Looking between them, Will shook his head. No. Marshal Boone stroked his beard. Then someone else wanted you protected. Maybe a conscience on Vance's payroll. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook. I've been tracking Vance's dealings in Chicago for a while. Fraud, extortion, racketeering. But nothing would stick. Until now. Clara stepped forward. He tried to have us killed. Boone nodded grimly. And that gives us what we need. Attempted murder, trespassing, destruction of property, not to mention endangering children. Will narrowed his eyes. Where is he now? Boone gave a thin smile. About 3 miles north, limping and cursing. We picked him up at sunrise. Clara let out a long breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Will he stand trial? She asked. He will win an itemen. In a federal court, Boone said, and he won't be buying his way out of this one. Will exhaled deeply and leaned back. Good. Boone glanced at the baby in Clara's arms, then back at Will. You two married? The question hung in the room like smoke. Clara opened her mouth. then closed it again. Her heart began to pound. Will looked at her. "We aren't," he said, slowly, "sure anymore. But I signed the birth certificates. I gave those boys my name." Marshall Boone scratched his chin. "I'd recommend making it official. Legal guardianship is solid. But with Vance gone, others may come sniffing if they think there's uncertainty." Clara's throat tightened. Was this what they were now, two survivors tied together by circumstance and law? Or was it something more? Boone left an hour later with his men and their prisoner. When the sound of hoofbeats faded down the snowy path, Clara and Will were alone again. She stood at the window, arms crossed. "You didn't answer him," she said without turning. "About marriage." Will shifted in the chair, wincing at the pain in his thigh. "I wanted to hear your answer first, he said. "Didn't seem fair to speak for you." She turned to face him. "You signed their names on paper. Warna wita warna. You put your life between us and bullets. If that's not love, I don't know what is." He blinked, stunned by her bluntness. Clara walked toward him, slow but sure. "When I lost everything, I thought the world had no more kindness left in it. Then you came, and I didn't ask for your heart, or your name, or this roof over our heads, but you gave them anyway. I would again, he said hoarsely. She sank to her knees before him, taking his hand. "I don't need a wedding dress or a preacher," she said, "but I want to be your wife." Will Thorne, Hekursanane, Witonenon. Will looked down at her, his hand trembling in hers. "Then you already are." The wedding was small. Marshall Boone returned 2 days later to officiate. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, and Clara wore a simple blue dress borrowed from the general store. Will, still limping, stood tall with a cleaned-up beard and a fresh scar above his eye. As the sun set behind the Wind River Range, they stood on the porch of the rebuilt barn, hands clasped. "You may kiss the bride," Boone said with a half-smile. Will didn't wait for permission twice. The kiss was warm, slow, attentive, and full of the silent vows they hadn't spoken. "I will protect you. I will stay. I will never let the past take you from me." The twins squealed from their cradle nearby, as if approving. That night, with the fire crackling and the snow glittering under moonlight, Will and Clara sat side by side in the parlor, watching their son sleep. "There's still work to do," Will said softly. "Rebuilding the barn, getting new livestock, making this place whole again." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "This place was whole the moment we stopped running." He kissed her temple. Gently, "You gave me back my life, Clara, and you gave me a future." Outside, winter's grip loosened a little, and inside, the warmth of a new beginning burned brighter than the fire ever could. Summer came slow but sure to the valleys beneath the Wind River Range. The snow melted in rivulets that turned to creeks. Wildflowers burst across the hills in a riot of color: indigo lupines, bright yellow balsam root, fireweed licking the edges of fallen pine trunks. The grass grew long and sweet again, and the ranch, once scarred by fire and blood, began to breathe anew. Silver Creek Ranch had never looked more alive. The barn, rebuilt with timber from the nearby ridge, stood proud against the sky, its roof red and sharp-edged, its doors wide open to welcome back the rhythm of livestock and labor. The hands worked hard but sang while they did it, their voices rising like birdsong in the morning light. And in the house that had once echoed only with silence, there was now laughter. Not just the bubbling coos of two growing baby boys, but Clara's voice reading aloud, singing lullabies, talking to Will in the kitchen while she stirred a pot of stew or washed apples from the orchard. She moved with ease through the house, the sadness in her eyes long since replaced by something rooted and radiant. Peace, perhaps, or something stronger, belonging. On the porch, Will Thorne sat in a sturdy rocking chair he'd carved himself, twin sons asleep in his lap. They were bigger now, 6 months old and strong as colts, Elijah and Samuel. Elijah had Clara's eyes, deep and storm-colored, and Samuel had Will's stubborn brow. They'd both started teething and screaming and grabbing everything in sight. But to Will, even the chaos was a kind of hymn. He looked up as Clara stepped onto the porch behind him. She carried a blanket and a soft smile. They wore themselves out trying to crawl up the hallway, she said, sitting down beside him and tucking the blanket around the boys. "You're a better lullaby than anything I sing." Will chuckled low. "They just know they're safe." Clara looked out over the hills. The light was golden now, warm and slow, painting the valley with fire. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, she whispered. Stillness. Like, the world can rest. Will reached for her hand. We earned it. She turned toward him, eyes glistening. We did more than survive. Why, Will? We made something out of the wreckage. He squeezed her hand, thumb brushing over her wedding ring, the one he'd given her 2 months ago. Simple silver. So smooth and warm from wear. We built a home. Later that evening, after the twins were fed and bathed and tucked into their crib beneath soft lantern light, Will lit the old kerosene lamp on the mantel and poured Clara a cup of tea. They sat in the parlor, facing the hearth, where only glowing embers remained. Clara sipped her tea slowly. I got another letter. Randa Bashur. Will raised an eyebrow. From the orphanage in St. Louis, she explained. They're asking if I'd come speak. Tell my story. Other young women, ones with no family, no safety, they want to hear that there's hope after being cast out. Will tilted his head thoughtfully. Would you want to? Clara looked down into her cup. Part of me does, but another part, I don't want to leave the boys. Or you. Will leaned closer, resting his hand on her knee. You wouldn't be leaving us. You'd be showing the world what survival looks like. What strength is. Clara's eyes softened. You think I'm strong. I know you are. Voicery. Stashari Hinawar, he said. You walked through snow and blood and heartbreak and still chose to love again. She blinked back emotion. Then maybe, yes, maybe I will go. Not now, but soon in Stiwan. For them. And for me. He smiled, quiet pride in his eyes. We'll be waiting here when you get back. This ranch will still be yours. This life ours. Outside, the night wrapped the land in velvet. A warm breeze swept over the long grass, and coyotes howled from the distant foothills. But inside the house, all was calm. Clara crept into the twins' room before bed, brushing a kiss to each of their foreheads. She sang softly just a few notes of an old lullaby, her voice barely more than a breath. She turned and found Will watching from the doorway. Do you ever wonder, she whispered, what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? He walked forward, gently pulling her into his arms. No. Because I can't imagine a life without you in it. That world doesn't exist for me. She rested her head against his chest. You gave us everything. No, he said. You reminded me I had something left to give. A week later, Marshal Boone returned to the ranch. He came not in uniform, but in a work shirt and trail coat, a casual visitor passing through. His horse was dusty, and his face sunburnt, but he smiled when he saw Clara and Will waving from the porch. Looks like you two are settling into this whole happily ever after thing, he said, tying his reins. Clara laughed. Trying our best. Boone joined them for coffee under the cottonwood tree beside the creek. The twins crawled on a blanket nearby, giggling over a wooden rattle shaped like a horse. I brought news. Boone said, after a few sips. Elias Vance was sentenced. 25 years at Fort Leavenworth. No parole random one sinem. Will nodded solemnly. Justice. A registered moderation. Then, more than that. It wasn't Durham, Boone added. Turns out, Elias's holdings were liquidated. A judge ordered restitution to victims of his schemes, including Clara. Clara's eyes widened. Me? You and the boys. Boone confirmed. There's a trust being established. It won't make you rich, but it'll ensure those boys get an education. A future. She looked at Will, stunned. After everything, something good came of it. Will reached for her hand. Because you never stopped fighting. That night, after Boone had ridden off and the sun dipped low, Will and Clara lay together on a quilt beneath the open stars. The baby slept nearby, bundled in the cradle Will had carved from pine. The fire crackled in the pit. The creek sang softly to itself. I used to think the land was cursed, Will said suddenly, eyes fixed on the sky. Every time I looked at this place, all I saw was what I lost. And now, if in worm, Clara whispered. He turned to her, brushing a lock of hair from her brow. Now I see what I found. She cupped his face. You found me when I was broken. You helped me put the pieces back. He kissed her gently, a promise in the touch. No, he said. We healed each other. And in the distance, across the plains, the wind carried a lullaby soft, steady, full of love, a mother's voice. A father's vow, a family born not from perfect beginnings, but from the unyielding courage to love again.